Welcome back, Grimdark Legion. In today's video we'll be taking a look at metal, in particular armour, and I'll show you various methods of rendering heavily weathered, pitted and rusty steel. I'll cover such topics as pre-weathering to add distinct texture and character, realistic rust applications using mixed media, battle damage and detailing. Today's subject will be the monstrous, terrifying, armour-clad behemoth that is a Sin Eater from Trench Crusade, a perfect canvas to explore heavy corrosion, texture and varied tones of rust. I am Black Chalice Studio and you are watching the Grimdark Compendium. To be able to approach rust applications in an effective manner and achieve a realistic result, it helps to know what rust actually is and how it occurs. Rust is an iron oxide, usually reddish brown in tone, that is formed by the reaction of iron and oxygen in the catalytic presence of water or moisture in the air. Given sufficient time, any iron mass in the presence of moisture can convert entirely into rust. In its most common description, it is the corrosion of elemental iron and its alloys, such as steel. Adding rust effects to our miniatures can help add layers of detail, character and immersion, reflecting the effect that harsh, dystopian and unforgiving environments can take on the armour, equipment and gear of our miniatures. The Sin Eater is perfect for displaying effects like rust, with his large expanses of heavy armour, weaponry and details like chainmail. When working with rust applications, there are many viable methods. My preference is to add texture via pre-weathering, then work from my darkest tones upwards, introducing lighter values and visual interest throughout the process. So, now we know what rust is and how it occurs, let us begin. The Sin Eater is already a very imposing and characterful sculpt as is. However, I always like to make a few subtle additions to alter the overall silhouette and provide an additional layer of detail. I decided to add a few sections of modelling chain to both wrists, across one piece of thigh armour and one shoulder pad to break up the large expanses of plain metal. Cheesecloth was applied to the lower cape to provide some visual diversity between upper and lower. I then made use of the Tamiya putty texturing technique on all of the armour to give a pitted and varied finish over the original flat plate. Some physical distressing was my first port of call in adding more depth to the armour, scratching, scraping and cutting at areas that would naturally take damage during battle. You can add as much or as little as you see fit here. Our first use of texture will be AK Corrosion Texture Paste, applied slightly thinned to crevices around prominent details and areas of the metals which would see the heaviest rusting. I built this up over a couple of layers here, and after each application I came in with a damp brush to remove any of the paste that was on the flat portions of the armour, leaving the Tamiya putty texture as the predominant finish. Our second and final texture pass is with Vallejo Thick Mud, applied primarily to the lower legs and greaves. I also applied this to both sections of cape, creating some visual interest and tying the miniature into the muddy trench base he stands upon. As soon as I've applied the paste to one section, I'll quickly wipe off my brush and feather at the edges, creating a smooth transition. With the pre-weathering steps complete, this is how we're looking so far. Moving on to the priming stage, we'll come in with our trusty Stynel Res Black, built up over 2 to 3 thin coats through the airbrush at 25 psi. After 15 minutes drying time, we can move on. Our final bit of airbrush work today will be laying down Deepkin flesh in a zenithal manner over the corpse, entrails, skulls and lower cape. My initial layer is just to block the colour down evenly, and with each successive layer I focus more towards where light would naturally catch, places like the top of the skulls and the corpse, and the raised folds of the cloak. Here I've applied the other base coats by brush. For the upper cape I've used a 1-to-1 mix of Vallejo Tire Black and Abaddon Black. For the armour I used 1-to-1 Abaddon Black and Lead Belcher. For the hammer I've used straight Lead Belcher, and for the bronze areas I've used Pro Acryl Bronze. To push the pitted and ancient steel look on the armour, over the dark matte base coat I applied, I'll thin down some Lead Belcher and lightly load a brush before carefully stippling this on, avoiding the recesses. With each thinned coat, I'll concentrate more towards the upper facing edges and reflection points. This application method will help build a varied and slightly textured finish over a normal application. Okay, so for our unifying wash for everything but the corpse, I came in with a 1-to-1 mix of Decrepit Filth and Goon's Grime. This will darken down the Goon's Grime whilst retaining the warm brown hue, also adding some extra granulation. Applied slightly thinned in a fairly liberal manner, I'll mop up any pooling with a damp brush. After waiting half an hour for the unifying wash to take hold and stain the acrylics, I'll come in for a basic reductive pass. Using a Q-tip lightly dampened with spirits, I'll reactivate and remove the wash from the raised areas, leaving the crevices nice, dark and grimy. I'll perform one light, overall reductive pass to the majority of the miniature, then go back for a second in areas I want to have a cleaner look. The next step I took was a crevice wash with a slightly thinned Ichor of the Damned. This will push the shadows even further, adding some more contrast. It will also blend nicely with the unifying wash, creating some smooth transitions. Repeat applications to certain areas will darken them even further. A quick feathering pass with the Q-tip and spirits will soften off any visible edges where we applied the crevice wash and clean things up a touch, ready for our next step. We're about to start having some real fun here with our first application of rust. So here is where we'll lay down the foundation for the colour and placement of our rust effect on the armour and weapon. Using neat sector rust and a fine tip brush, I'll lay this down in a nice even layer to the crevices, textured areas and some of the flat panels on the metallic areas. This dark orange hue is perfect as our first layer. After 15 minutes, I'll come back in and soften the edges of the rust pass using a Q-tip dampened with spirits. By tapping gently at the visible edges, you can create some really nice mottled transitions. I'll also come back here to clean off some of the raised details, revealing the metallic shine underneath. To introduce a lighter, slightly more vibrant secondary rust colour, I'll use Ex Machina, once again applied neat. Covering slightly less area than before, I'll add this in small patches, mixing it into the sector rust in places to create some striking colour variations where they blend together. Some of these areas are quite vibrant and saturated at this point, but we'll begin to bring these down a touch later on. As before, we'll just come in again to break up and soften any visible edges where we applied the Ex Machina, using a Q-tip dampened with spirits, always aiming to create interesting, smooth and mottled transitions. Our last step in laying down the rust foundation is to come in with a darker, more brownish tone, and Decrepit Filth is perfect for this. With its super dark, dead matte and granulated finish, this will work perfectly for our deep crevices and areas of oldest rust. Applied neat and sparingly with a fine brush, this will contrast really nicely against the lighter tones we've laid down. Now it's time to reinforce and bring some depth to our rust tones. First up, we're going to use Dirty Down Rust, neat from the bottle. In its neat form, Dirty Down has a thick, dense consistency. We only have a short time to work with it neat, as it dries extremely quickly. This will be our darkest, oldest rust effect, and I place this into crevices, around details, and onto the lower portions of the armour plates, almost in a stippling manner. It'll dry with a textured, crusty, dark brown finish, and if we apply a second layer to certain areas, we can darken it up even further. By introducing water to Dirty Down, either by diluting it or brushing it on afterwards, we can manipulate the finish to be a lighter colour. This second pass is thinned a touch and applied as small patches and dots over our previous step. You won't see much of a difference initially, but as it dries, you'll notice it gets considerably lighter. Our final step with Dirty Down is a heavily diluted pass, applied very sparingly to areas we want to represent the lightest, freshest rust. This will dry to a powdery, light orange yellowish tone, accenting the previous two steps very nicely. In a similar manner to how we can reduce and refine enamels with spirits, we can do the same with Dirty Down, using water. By lightly loading a stiff bristled brush with water, we can stipple and dab at any visible edges from the previous steps, breaking them up, creating smooth transitions and an interesting mottled look. With our rust in place, we can now come in to punch up the contrast and detail the metals. First up, I'll do a very light dry brush of lead belcher across the heavily textured areas like the chains and the larger edges. Use thin paint and a lightly loaded brush to keep these highlights quite subtle. We'll use the same approach for the chainmail here as well, just light strokes, starting at the top and working our way downwards. For the broader, more flat areas, I'll switch over to the stippling technique to give an irregular finish. I'll thin the paint down even further, load my brush, then wipe off most of the pigment onto the back of my glove, before gently tapping at the areas of armour where light would reflect. Build this up over a couple of thin passes, just to increase the effect. With this step, we can add a lot of detail to the armour and the weapon. Using a fine tip brush, I'll come in with heavily diluted paint, lightly loaded, and begin adding small lines and dots to simulate scratches, small dents and points of reflection. Follow the areas of pre-weathering abrasion we added earlier and try to imagine what places damage would occur during battle, from attacks with close combat weapons and firearms alike. You can add a ton of character here, so just have fun and keep going until you're happy. With my painting style, I go back and forth quite a lot, working from dark to light and back down again, refining things until I'm happy. To that end, there are a few spots of rust that were just a tad too bright for me. Glazing on a thin Ichor of the Damned will tone these down nicely without altering the underlying colour too much. With that final step complete, we've rendered our heavily weathered, battle-damaged and rusty steel armour, with varied tones, lots of different textures, and plenty of visual interest. These steps can be applied to any armour or weapons, be it fantasy, futuristic, and everything in between. Rust knows not the difference. To complete the miniature, I came in with a variety of environmental effects on the capes, ranging from dust applications to tie him into the bombed out trench basing scheme, decay applications to show aged, decrepit cloth, and heavy shading and addition of texture to the folds using Villainy ink from both Phase 1 and 2. These effects can make a profound difference to the overall aesthetic and mood of the miniature. And the Sin Eater wouldn't be right without a copious amount of blood and gore. This was achieved using Carrion Crimson and Caput Mortem from Phase 2 of Villainy ink across various application methods like stippling, glazing and the spattering technique to create a horrific final look. To see these methods in depth, along with many other ways of rendering Grimdark cloth and flesh, check out some of the fantastic videos by Dark Ages Workshop, Zatcaskagoon Miniatures, the Feral Painter and myself over on the Grimdark Compendium. And here we have the end result, the horrific, feral and monstrous Sin Eater. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed today's video. For many more like it, head on over to the Grimdark Compendium. If you make your way there now, you can catch episode 2 of Dark Ages Workshop's Trench Crusade Trench Pilgrim's course, The War Prophet. I bid you a good week, keep it grim, and I'll see you next time.